written in an era of a strong belief in the chain of being, and an omnipresent fear of the wrath of the heavens, Shakespeare's King Lear develops Goneril into an unnatural, masculine usurper of the chain of being. The passage takes place after Goneril broke the bonds of family, after she cast Lear out and demonstrated her animalistic and vengeful instinct. Now, the natural order being broken, the audience expects a consequence. Albany, previously only disapproving, now works himself into full conflict with Goneril. The struggle between two competing ideologies, between Goneril's elevation of the animal and Albany's understanding of the natural order's importance, creates a central tension in the text. The text centrally asserts that when one allows one's animal nature to remain untamed, the result is the breaking of family bonds and chaos. Goneril's defining characteristic is her rejection of the chain of being. Throughout the passage, she elevates the animal and disregards the importance of wisdom and goodness. Goneril's fixation on the superiority of brute force and vengeful nature is first exemplified when she chooses to cast aside her distaff in exchange for taking up the arms of war. Here, Goneril is using metaphor. The distaff represents not just woman's work, but also the caring domestic role that she was meant to fulfill for her family. Abandoning her natural duty, Goneril instead chooses the arms of war, the violence and the animal nature. Goneril's vicious and vengeful nature is further exemplified in her association with animal imagery. In the line, "I have been worth the whistle," Goneril is alluding to an expression that is typically using monotony to describe the value of a dog. By appropriating and even embracing the animal imagery, Goneril demonstrates that her previous uptaking of masculine symbols wasn't just born out of a desire to flip the chain of being, but rather out of disregard for it entirely. Goneril's rejection of the authority of the laws of nature begins the power struggle that dominates the passage. In Elizabethan England, the materiality and the lack of spirituality of the vicious dog should have put it at the bottom of the chain of being, yet Goneril willingly associates herself with the dog symbol. The result develops Goneril's lack of sight and confusion. Although the dog is nothing, she embraces it, taking it to be substance. By following her own unnatural laws as opposed to the laws of nature, Goneril creates chaos. Under that context of Goneril, who occupies a position of power despite being unhinged and chaotic, the character of Albany is introduced almost as a foil. Whereas previously Goneril had been overconfident in the success of her plans to grab power, Albany prophesizes a much dimmer consequence. In his opening line, "You are not worth the dust which the rude wind blows in your face," the heavy repetition of the D sound gives this phrase a seeming perception of weight and slows down the rhythm so that we get a stark contrast between Goneril's chaos and Albany's organized thoughts. Albany uses aphorism when he tells Goneril that she that herself would sliver and disbranch from her material sap, perforce must wither and come to deadly use. Here the applying of a blanket statement served to create a perception of universal order, as well as reminding Goneril that she is not exempt from certain rules. Next, cacophony is used in the line, "That nature, which contemns its origin, cannot be boarded certain itself." The two harsh k sounds leave the actor basically gasping for air and then spitting at the audience. This creates a sort of sense of chaos, which is then contrasted with the word certain, a softer C sound that is by contrast softer and creates a feeling of being anchored. In the tone of his speech, Albany is demonstrating to the audience first the chaos that Goneril is creating, and then by contrast the certainty that they could have had otherwise. By communicating his argument through his tone as well as his words, Shakespeare allows Albany's speech to be much more compelling as well as emotionally salient to the audience. The fear that should have naturally been roused by Goneril's chaos is now going to be doubly reinforced by the cacophonous sounds. By choosing to call Lear Goneril's origin as opposed to her father, Albany emphasizes both Goneril's similarity to Lear as well as what she owes to him. If he is her origin, if she comes from him, then they must be the same. Albany's understanding of family ties shows both his profound respect for the natural order as well as his sight and substance. Secondly, Albany uses repetition to emphasize a point. By saying she that herself would sliver, instead of just using one or the other, he draws attention to Goneril's gender. In using this redundancy, Albany reminds us that Goneril's betrayal of Lear was doubly bad because as a woman, she had a duty and an obligation to family that should have been stronger than most. And although this mirrors Goneril's speech, in which she proudly demonstrates her disdain for the trappings of femininity, Albany's speech is a reproach, and his criticism is only intensified in the next line when he describes the imagery of sap and wither. The sap is fresh and youthful, it is the source of life. One imagines the youthful beauty of Cordelia. By contrast, the withered branch is barren. One is reminded at once of the curse Lear placed on Goneril's womb, as well as the unnatural crones who were persecuted as witches during King James's reign. By using the image of the shriveled branch, and then going on to vaguely invoke the image of the witch, Albany is communicating to Goneril that her unnatural behavior isn't going to bring her the paragon of animal strength and fortitude that she would claim to have, but rather is going to sap her strength and leave her a shell of a woman. Her fate is going to be lonely and pitiful. In response to this, Goneril only begins to say, "No more, the text is foolish." Over the course of the entire passage, Goneril insists on calling Albany fool. And whereas Albany's speech demonstrated insight and substance, Goneril buries her head in the sand and refuses to hear it. And while many characters in King Lear showed a lack of self-knowledge, Goneril's overt insistence on refusing to hear the truth is what separates her from characters that are redeemed, like Lear or Gloucester. Recognizing the significance of this attitude, Albany works himself into further certainty and into further opposition with Goneril. His words become harsher, whereas previously Goneril was a branch, now she's something more sinister. In his first line, "Wisdom and goodness to the vile seem vile," the words wisdom and goodness are euphonic and seem expansive. They are slow and they seem to fill up the line. By contrast, vile seem vile is wordplay and it's very, very quick. The juxtaposition of two big, expansive words to describe what is wise and what is good, as opposed to just one word to describe what is vile, creates subconsciously the notion that the wise and the good must be more nuanced, must have more depth, and must have much more substance. By contrast, the wordplay of vile seem vile speeds up the end of the sentence, so that wisdom and goodness seems like everything, and vile seems like nothing. When Albany conveys such truths, we know that he must be substance, and we know that he must have sight. Albany then goes on to argue that filths savor but themselves. With the predatory imagery of savor and the spitting F of filth, Albany demonstrates his disgust for Goneril's lust for power. The lines, "What have you done? What have you performed?" use iambic pentameter to stress the heavy D sounds of done and performed. This reflects an emphasis on Goneril's agency. It is her actions that will now incur punishment. Albany then goes on to juxtapose animal imagery with imagery reflecting the tender ties of family bonds. As such, Albany begins to draw a comparative between what it means to be kind and human and what it means to be vicious and animal. The comparative turns into a dichotomy in the line "tigers, not daughters." The tiger symbolically represents Goneril, embodying both her lust for power and her viciousness in the European psyche. Albany asserts that categorically, when one indulges her animalistic tendencies, she violates the sanctity of her human bonds. Whereas previously Goneril had characterized status as something to be seized with brute force, Albany presents an antithesis. Juxtaposed with the untamed ferocity of tigers, Albany presents us an image of a father and a gracious aged man, whose reverence even the head-legged bear would lick. With this tone of admiration, Albany casts Lear into a scene of kind domesticity. The soft, lispy euphony of reverence and gracious illustrate Albany's argument that substance should come from kindness and goodness, as opposed to the raw animal strength that Goneril values. Albany rounds out his argument by talking about the head-legged bear, who would still lick Lear's reverence. The bear represents the animalistic nature within man, and the ring through its nose represents the ability to tame the animalistic nature, thus restoring order. The ability to gain sight and substance in this way invokes the theme of individual actions versus fate. It was not fate that condemned Goneril, but rather her own refusal to tame her animalistic side. Line 46 represents a distinct shift in the text. Whereas previously Albany had been using soft, happy imagery like the family in order to reproach Goneril for destroying it, now he chooses to describe the consequences in harsh imagery that will befall humanity. The nihilistic and fatalistic tone of the play come to a head in the following segments, with the heavy repetition of the "d" sound weighing down the segments and creating a perception of doom. In the lines of "the heavens do not their visible spirits send down to tame these vile offenses," the repetition of the sound of "v" connect vile and visible in a way that reminds us of Lear's speech in the Rain, in which he calls upon the heavens to punish the sins of man. By creating this parallel between the speeches of Albany and Lear, Shakespeare subtly signals Albany's changing allegiance. Albany finishes his prophecy with dark and chilling imagery, saying, "It will come, Humanity must perforce prey on itself, like monsters of the deep. This imagery of cannibalism, an almost unthinkable desecration of natural human bonds, is truly horrifying and chills the audience. In contrast to Albany's speech, full of high, lofty claims, Goneril's reply seems almost shallow and one-dimensional. She focuses exclusively on the parts of man as opposed to man as a whole, saying, milk-livered, a cheek for blows, a head for wrongs, in thy brows an eye. And this demonstrates Goneril's blindness. Instead of being able to see man for the spirituality that ties him together, she instead focuses on his parts, reducing him to the physicality of a mere beast. Goneril's blindness and failure to understand what makes a man substance is what ultimately brings her chaos. Goneril has no self-knowledge and refuses to understand that her actions, by being a tiger instead of a daughter, will bring massive chaos into the world. In the end, Goneril's refusal to tame her animal nature in order to be able to fulfill the roles of her family bonds and obey the natural order is what brings about destruction. Albany, having become a seer with substance, is able to recognize Goneril's chaos and stand in opposition to it. Albany's speech both leaves us recognizing the full extent and gravity of Goneril's unnatural sins, as well as full of hope that order will one day be restored.